Good evening, everyone. I'm Rebecca Price with the Nashville Public Library's Special Collections Division, which is located on the second floor of the downtown library, which I am so excited to say is finally opening up after almost 10 months on March 30th. So please come visit us. Special Collections on the second floor is home to two of Nashville's beloved community spaces, the Civil Rights Room and the Votes for Women's Room. And if you haven't visited those spaces yet, I invite you all to come downtown and explore these places that tell stories and share experiences of Nashville's rich and diverse history. I want to welcome everyone for tonight's program and extend a special thank you to the Nashville Public Library Foundation and the Sandra Shatton Foundation for making tonight's program possible. We also thank all of you for joining us here tonight and for those watching live on YouTube. As such, please be mindful that we are recording tonight's presentation. Conversations at NPL broadens the work done by Special Collections in those two program spaces, the Civil Rights Room and the Votes for Women's Room, where we engage students of all ages, members of corporations, community-based organizations, and more in critical and reflective conversations on history, culture, and modern society. Each year, we focus on a particular theme to allow for deeper dives into our history and our understanding of who we are today. And tonight, we are excited to launch our first author talk in the 2026 season, Labor. At its core, labor refers to human effort, physical and mental, employed in the production of goods and services. But labor is more than work. Labor is a fundamental concept that has shaped societies throughout history. It fulfills societal needs, it grows communities, and it is essential in the development of culture. But what happens when labor is exploited? What happens when labor is devalued as a pillar of a sustainable and thriving society? With labor as our framework, Conversations at NPL will pose these questions and more over the season as we explore issues of equality, work, and the intersection of labor and politics on our communities and democracy. We begin the season tonight revisiting a radical 1970s movement for economic and social justice tied to housework. We'll conclude the season on June 12th with our second author talk featuring Dr. Mary Frances Berry and her newly published book, Slavery After Slavery, revealing the legacy of forced child apprenticeships on Black families from emancipation to the present. For tonight, please join me in welcoming Emily Callaci, historian of modern Africa, global feminism, and decolonization from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, for a conversation on her recent publication, Wages for Housework, the Feminist Fight Against Unpaid Labor. Wages for Housework is the fascinating international story of Selma James, Sylvia Federici, Mariosa Della Costa, Wilmette Brown, and Margaret Prescott, whose movement demanded wages as a starting point for remaking the world as we know it. Drawing on their campaign's roots in the 1970s America, Italy, and the UK, with original archival research and interviews, historian Emily Callaci explores the revolutionary potential of paying women for their work in the home and how Wages for Housework reimagined potential futures under capitalism and beyond in ways that continue to be relevant today. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you.
And now, I'd like to turn the evening over to our host, Tasneem Ansaria Grace, humanities scholar and vice president of Mosaic Changemakers, a local nonprofit that seeks to weave a better South by uplifting, growing, and connecting leaders of color. As a student and teacher of the global struggles for liberation, she continues to use conversations and stories as a pathway to developing and sustaining community. Tasneem.
Thank you. Good to be with you all. Thank you very much. I am drawn to certain words that Rebecca used in introducing Emily and myself, and that was community and conversation. And so what you all are going to experience is a conversation between two female-identifying human beings who are also moms, who are also writers, who also love to write and read books, and also are interested in the conversation around who we are and why we are. And so, Emily, I'm going to start there. I read this book and immediately had to call my mother and talk to her about this idea around being paid for something she considers to be, and several people in the book also agree, women's work and what moms do and what women do. And I love that you gave us a reason to think twice and 3 times, if not 4 times about that, but also think, where do I fall in this understanding of what work is and should we get paid for it and who pays? So why and how did you come up with an interest in this movement from the 1970s? And where did it take you when you became a mom and began to connect to it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question, and thank you so much for being here with me. This is such a pleasure. So I started really thinking about housework, really seriously the first time, like many of us when I became a parent for the first time. You know, I think that for much of my childhood, I was blissfully unaware of how much work was going on to make me a person, as I think was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a university professor. I have thought of my working life being very much a life of the mind. I write, I read, I teach students. That's how I thought about the role of work in my life. And then I had my first child, and I had an all too familiar experience, but one that was shocking to me of just relentless work. Some of it very rewarding and nurturing, some of it very boring, sometimes disgusting, if I'm honest, caring for small little bodies. And I just, to become aware of that work in my own life, suddenly made me look at the world around me very differently. It's almost like getting X-ray glasses, and suddenly I can see how much work is happening all around me all the time. Not only by other parents, but also by other parents who perhaps have children with special needs, people who are caring for elderly parents. Beyond that kind of care work, people who, when I was in the hospital giving birth were like, cleaning the hospitals, changing the bedpans of patients, even extending to things like, having my trash picked up every week. Suddenly I had this sense of I'm a worker in this new way. And, despite all the differences between me and all these other people, we share this thing in common of doing this really vital, essential work, which is caring for people, caring for our environments we live in. And that was really a pretty transformative thing for me.
Can we take it to your book? Can you read to us?
Sure.
Where you kind of explain this big question that you have to confront around understanding how motherhood has changed the relationship to capitalism.
Okay. For most of my life, I did not think very much about housework. A middle-class teenager in the girl power 1990s, I learned that my liberation would come through education, creative expression, and professional success. Thanks to the efforts of feminists who came before me, I never felt I had to rebel all that hard against the expectation of feminized domesticity. I intended to spend my time on Earth on more meaningful things: love, politics, music, beauty. What did housework have to do with me? It seemed like a quaint preoccupation, the relic of an older generation's outdated and irrational beliefs about gender. That women were associated with housework seemed a category mistake. Correct that mistake and you fix the problem. But then when I became a mother, housework became inescapable. I experienced the housework of motherhood differently than my mother, who quit her job as a social worker to raise me and my brothers until my youngest brother was old enough for school. I remember her at the dinner table in the evenings with the 3 of us, while my father was out doing what I imagined as very romantic work as a union organizer. In stories about my father's childhood, I picture his mother, my brilliant grandmother, who left the job as a journalist when her first child was born, tending lovingly and skillfully to 5 children, often while my grandfather wrote poetry in his attic study. She returned to journalism when she was in her 60s after her children were grown. When their children were school-aged, both my mother and grandmother became public school teachers, choosing careers that adapted to the rhythms of their children's lives. These images of my mother and grandmother invoke in me feelings of warmth, safety, and love. Still, I never expected to play a role similar to them. It seemed unproblematic to me to identify with the men in their work. I'd emulate the union organizer, the poet.
Why do you think that is? Why were you drawn to the poet and not to the person making the pancakes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I didn't really think about it so much until, maybe I'd internalized the sense that this work was less valuable. I mean, it's less valuable in the obvious sense that it's not compensated, but it's also not celebrated. It doesn't have a lot of status. And I think that also, and I mentioned growing up in the 90s, there was the real kind of idea of the girl boss is like what it means to be successful, So I think that in some ways I internalized the idea that it was low status, and that if I was going to do it, it was going to kind of be hidden. It wasn't going to be central to my identity, maybe.
I get that. And I love this sentence that you sort of end some of this self-declaration with. I am a beneficiary of the exploitative social arrangement.
Yeah.
By participating, I also feel that I am undermining myself. I consent to a world in which the work of caring for children, the work that for the past few years I've spent most of my time on, is valued less than the work of being a professor.
Absolutely.
Can you talk to us about when you had your first son? What was it like to admit to yourself that this wasn't romantic, that this was work? And what did it feel like to then go back to a place where you had made a home as an academic at the university?
Yeah, wow, it's so much to say about that. I think one of the things that was really stark to me, and you mentioned it a little bit in that passage you just read, was the feeling of, taking this precious child of mine, I mean, because all children are precious, and when I went back to work and dropping him, at where he went to daycare with these incredibly skilled women, they were women, who cared for him all day. I remember coming to pick him up one day from daycare, and he couldn't even talk yet. He was, I think, like 1.5 or something, and he's sitting around a table with 5 other little children, and the teacher has guided them in like making their own muffins and then serving them to each other, and they're all pouring each other milk and getting it all over the place. But like, it's just like, I just blew my mind that someone could actually do that, like what a struggle it is to get one toddler to do anything. I was like, this is incredibly skilled work on top of the work they're doing, helping my kid learn how to use the toilet, teaching and cleaning up after him, all these really important, difficult jobs, and at the same time teaching them how to live in community with each other. And I'm just thinking, what on earth could be more valuable than that to society? And it's, it's paid a pittance compared with the other jobs in our society that I would argue have far less value to us, So I think that realization, that feeling of a total disconnect where this work is not considered high status, it's not paid very much. If it's done in the home by the parent, it's not paid at all. In contrast with my other job that is held in, more esteem and that gives me more accolades, that felt to me like an injustice and in a kind of contradiction within my own life, and it made me want to look more at it.
Can you help our audience understand this connection that you were exploring, the connection between motherhood, housework, and capitalism? What I had to keep reading it, and I got it, and I want to hear you help me get there even closer. How are they connected?
Sure. Well, maybe the best way to talk about that is to mention one of the people in the book, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa. And she grew up in Italy, and she became really politically active in the 60s. And at the center of her politics was worker politics, particularly factory workers, and the idea of the assembly line being the site of producing wealth for capitalism and also a site of exploitation of workers' labor. And what she said is that, yes, that's what happens, but you have to imagine that the assembly line extends beyond the factory doors into the home where someone has raised that worker. Right. Someone is still likely cooking his breakfast. Someone is likely doing his laundry. Someone is actually making him able to work. And that's the person who's doing housework, right? And so housework, she argues, is not outside of the capitalist economy. It's actually central to it. And pulling the veil off of that, recognizing that as work, is a fundamental challenge to that system and the way it exploits women.
Do audiences readily get that?
Yeah, so I think that audiences readily get that our entire society and economy relies on the work that women do and don't get recognition for and don't get payment for. They recognize the injustice, for example, of somebody who might spend her entire life looking after her children, her family members, people in the community, and retire in poverty because she has not made any money doing that. They recognize that as very wrong. I think the thing that's harder for people to get is the argument that the wages for housework women made, which is that it should be paid for,
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree with you. When I've talked about your book to people, the first question they say is, well, who's going to pay? Where are they getting the money from? So who's going to pay, Emily?
Well, I think that's one of the tensions within the movement. I mean, most basically they would say the government, and we have, versions of this with things like the child tax credit. We have it in the welfare system, I think they would argue that doesn't go nearly far enough, but it's a start. But at the same time, I think they would recognize that capitalism goes beyond national boundaries, It doesn't all happen within the borders of the nation state, right? I mean, we can think about historically how our country has created wealth through exploiting wealth in the global south, for example. We can think about the history of the slave trade. We can think about all these ways that, exploiting labor happens also outside of national boundaries. We can think about, the way that undocumented people are exploited for their labor, right? And so some people in the movement would then say that we have to think about this also beyond the idea of governments and think about really changing the entire system.
I love that. You also write about Olufemi Taiwo, who talks about the constructionist model, and especially because we are here in the South and that we talk about plantations regularly, if you talk about taking tours and things, right, that there's a whole segment of the world that has achieved prosperity by taking labor and offering no wages for it. Perhaps even the building and campus we're on right now, that people have worked and received not a dime. And there's a connection between the wealth we live in today and that. Can you talk about reparations and how that comes up in your book? And I love that you make it intersectional in that way. So two of the women talk about Black women and wages for housework. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that intersectionality with ethnicity made great meaning in this movement?
Sure. So two of the women at the center of this book are Wilmette Brown and Margaret Prescott. And Wilmette Brown, she's from Newark, New Jersey. She grew up very active in the civil rights movement. She later went on to be a Black Panther. And then in the 1970s, right as second wave feminism is hitting New York City, she encounters wages for housework. And together with Margaret Prescott, forms Black Women for Wages for Housework. And Margaret Prescott, she is born in Barbados, while Barbados is still under colonial rule. And she has this real observation growing up that she lives in a part of the world that at one time in history was the wealthiest place in the world, because of the wealth of the slave trade that was, produced there. And yet she lived in relative poverty, right? And meanwhile, you see all these women from her community going to work abroad for wages to send back home, but the wages aren't high enough for them to actually bring their families with them. So she sees the ways that women bear the brunt of this system. And then she moves to New York, and she also becomes very involved in civil rights activism. And she and Wilmette Brown both initially joined the New York Wages for Housework Committee, but they find that the issues that Black women face in particular are not adequately addressed, in the organization as it was. So they formed their own branch of it called Black Women for Wages for Housework. And so Wilmette Brown, she really understood wages for housework as an extension of an argument for reparations, as, an idea that, one is that, this is not just a disparity of wealth that just is a coincidence, right? It's the result of centuries of exploitation and of wealth being extracted from one population to the benefit of another. And then, beyond that, and to kind of talk about, how she understood wages for housework fitting into that, you mentioned Olufemi Taiwo, the philosopher who, talks about reparations in this book he wrote called Reconsidering Reparations as more than just, paying back money that is owed, but as a way of repairing the harm and creating a better world in its place. So what Wilmette Brown and Margaret Prescott, I think, imagined with wages for housework, and particularly how it extended to a racial justice project, was to think about how to, create a world that valued that work, that repaired the damage done by all those years of exploitation and extraction, from Black women and the labor, but then also tried to imagine a world that actually was centered on that work, that was valued that care, that put Black women at the center. So that was really how they related wages for housework to the reparations argument.
Now you kept on with the intersectional theme because you also write about lesbians for wages for housework. How did that make sense in that community?
Sure. So in I believe it was 1978, although I might have the year wrong, but a group of women from Toronto there were lesbian women, and they were really interested in wages for housework. But similar to with Margaret Prescott and Wilmot Brown, they didn't want their identity and their politics as lesbians to kind of just be folded into, or kind of just being sort of integrated into the pre-existing movement. They wanted to still have their own autonomy as lesbian women. And so they started Wages Due Lesbians, which became an international organization. And one of the major issues that motivated them was the ways in which the welfare state as it existed really prioritized and sought to entrench the heteronormative family. And one of the big struggles they were facing at that time as lesbian women was child custody. If they came out as lesbian, they could lose custody of their children. They could be considered an unfit parent. And they really made common cause with women who were victims of domestic violence, because the thing that they both shared was women who were facing domestic violence were financially dependent on their partners or their husbands, right? So it's one thing to say, well, you have the right to get a divorce and leave, but if you don't have the financial autonomy to do so, you're stuck. I think, so the way they found common cause was saying wages for housework is about financial autonomy for women who do this work, so that they don't have to live in an exploitative situation, whether that's a heterosexual patriarchal family that keeps you in the closet, or whether that's a domestic violence situation. It was about valuing that work is a path towards financial autonomy for women, and then having freedom over the kinds of lives and families they want to create.
I love it. And I love that there's a part in the book where you say the wages for housework was not so that the women could then take time off and get a bigger job. It wasn't so that you could hire someone to take care of your children and then you can go corporate. You write it so you can take a nap. A swim in the ocean, slow, luxurious sex, time to nurture our friendships, time to participate meaningfully in politics, and that this is a way of feminism looking at liberation holistically, not just so you can achieve more and hustle and grind. How is this relating? How does this connect with your students? So you're a historian, you're talking about yesteryear, but you're working with folks who are actually creating a world for us. How do they connect to this?
Yeah. I was surprised and delighted how much students relate to some of these ideas. So I assigned some of these texts by these women in some of my classes, and I thought they would see it kind of as an historical relic, but they didn't. They really identified with it. And I think part of it is, one is that they're watching what's happening in the economy, and they're seeing that a lot of what was promised to us, if you work really, really hard and you can have it all, and you can have the house and the family and the career, they're seeing that promise being broken, and they're like, is that really how I want to live my life? I think a lot of them came of age during the COVID pandemic. They started to see care work everywhere, and to see how it, I think they grew up pretty fast in a way, because they could see that, in a way that perhaps it had been invisible before. A lot of them are watching climate change happen, and they are, angry at the way earlier generations treated productivity in the planet, as though we could just produce, extract, and now they're going to live with the consequence. I think they really question that constant productivity as the basis for a good life and a good way to live.
Are you seeing a break in the generation that you're teaching from using the language like I'm grinding, I'm hustling, I'm out there trying to burn all the daylight, I'll sleep when I'm dead? Where are they? Yeah, we've heard that, right? That if we are giving wages so people can rest, is there more conversation with your students around rest and restoration?
That's a great question. They're still the hustlers, for sure. They haven't, but I do think there is I think people do, and I think there's a lot more conversation right now about how to live in a community, and the value of rest and the value of spending time together, and I do think there's more of an emphasis on that maybe there was, in my generation.
I love it. I will say I delighted to see mention of Audre Lorde in your book.
Oh, yeah.
Mention of Grace Lee Boggs. I'm like, wow, okay, you really went full circle in terms of all the voices that were talking about how women need equitable lives. So I will have to ask you this. How have men benefited from this conversation?
So one of my favorite moments from the archives was there's this old video footage of Selma James. So Selma James, she's born in 1930 in a really radical community in Brooklyn. She's born in a Jewish family that's very politically active. She married the great Trinidadian Marxist theorist C.L.R. James. And so she's very politically, she's a revolutionary before, she's ready to go. And so there's this, she got into making documentaries as a way of, doing her politics. And there's this footage of her just kind of going around London and just shoving a microphone in people's faces and like, what do you think about housework? Like, what do you think? Do you work too much? Do you not work enough? How would this change your life? And one of my favorite interviews is with this young couple. And she's talking to this young man who's a young father, and he's the breadwinner in the family. And, he doesn't do any housework from what it sounds like in the conversation. And she asks him, don't you think you might be missing out on something by not taking care of your kids, by not having that time with them that your wife has? I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist of it. Yeah. And you can just see something in his eyes kind of light up, and thinking about what it would mean to actually share that work more equally, and to have care work be part of his life. I think so much of the wages for housework, we think about it as, housework sucks, and it does. Yep. But also, there are aspects of it that are actually quite rewarding, and that can actually create familial bonds. And, so I think there was a sense in which being the breadwinner, having that be your defined role because of your gender, that can be really restrictive too.
I get that. And I wonder if he arrived at that fatherhood was also extracting from capitalism, in the sense that he was at a loss for all the contributions he could make to his family because he had to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If he got to that what city was he in?
I think it was in London.
Get thee to London. That might be a change. One of the things that we're sort of grappling with is the fact that the people in the book are alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That you're a historian that got a chance to speak to history makers in the lives and in the moment that they're living now. What surprised you about talking to some of them?
The first big surprise I got is that they do not get along anymore. Oh. So that they're all amazing, but that posed some challenges for me as a researcher, because I'm doing oral history, and so I had to figure out ways to honor all of them and honor all their stories, but without becoming part of their struggles with each other. So that was one thing that was a bit of a challenge, but I think that I managed to do it in the end. But that was interesting to try to figure out, because I just it's a real, it was a challenge. But they all live such rewarding lives, far beyond the 70s and 80s when perhaps this movement was most kind of active. I remember they all just have people and community and conviction and purpose, all around them. And that's really wonderful to see. It really modeled for me what meaningful life and work could look like.
I love that. I love that you said model, because I'm curious as to if there are any other societies on the globe that have modeled the kind of equity that Wages for Housework purports to offer. Is there a bright spot somewhere that we can look to and say, they're doing it differently and it's working?
I think the most inspiring cases I've seen have been very small-scale experiments. People who, for example, live in blended families. People who have decided, the nuclear family house is not for me. I want to live with friends and raise our kids together. Those kinds of experiments, I think, offer an alternative model to this breadwinner, a housewife, or what's more common now, the dual income earning couple that is responsible for all the housework, all the income. I find that really inspiring, and I hope that it creates models for other ways of living in the future. I don't know if any country has got it right. I mean, people talk about the Scandinavian countries, and there's so much to admire there, and I'm very jealous of their maternity leave and all of their great social benefits. At the same time, like I mentioned before, it ends at their national borders, right? And we know capital is international, so if if all these welfare benefits are available, but only for your fellow countrymen, I don't know if that quite works, or if that's limited in that way, I guess,
Yeah. So. One of the, I love the seeking of this idea of utopia, and that comes up. There's a passage where the women actually sit and talk about an imagined world. And they do talk about the aunties and people who will pick up a baby when it cries and it may not be your child, that sort of thing. Yeah. One of the lines that I want you all to get that I think is really beautiful that you quote several times, and this is from Sylvia Federici. They say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. Can you talk about, in today's trad wife kind of conversation that's happening in social media, this idea that you should find total fulfillment in changing diapers or nursing or baking cookies. I'm just pulling things out.
Yeah.
Where does that conversation, where is it still popping up for people?
It's a great question. And I think that what that quotation, it's one of my favorite ones, they say it's love, we say it's unwaged work, is getting at the ways in which women are emotionally manipulated in doing this work. The big question is, if this is exploitative, it's not fair that we all do all this work for free. Well, why do we? And I think so much of it is love. Both you're taught that you should do it, it's in your nature, it's in your maternal instinct, it's feminine. But I think also we do genuinely love as well. Like most workers, if you're working in unfair circumstances, you can go on strike, you can walk away. That's unthinkable to do with your child because there'd be a victim there, which would be your own child who you love, So, your own love becomes the source of your own exploitation. And I think that's what they're trying to point to here. And so by defining work in this way, they're trying to do away with that romanticization and say, we're going to do away with the idea that work in a factory, in an office is real work, and work in the home is not work. We have to see it all for what it is, which is producing value for society. I think that comes up a lot in contemporary discussions about housework, and we have this wave of romanticizing housework, with the whole tradwife thing. And it reminds me of this brilliant article by Dorothy Roberts. I think it's from the late 90s, but Dorothy Roberts, the great legal scholar, and it's called Spiritual and Menial Housework, I think it's called. But it talks about how so much of the housework that we see as spiritual and virtuous, like reading children bedtime stories and making perfect little cookies and, what we now think of as very Instagrammable kinds of housework. How that, is something that largely elevates the work of middle-class people, and people who have the time and the leisure to do that in a certain way. But it leaves out, for example, the work of changing bedpans or scrubbing a dirty toilet or, cleaning the floors, when someone has been sick, right? It's hard to imagine that becoming Instagrammable or that becoming a source of, pride in the same way. And so what Roberts cautions against is basically separating out those kinds of housework and throwing under the bus the people who largely do that work for low wages and for not a lot of status. And so I think that's the real danger in thinking about, these very romanticized pictures of the virtues of housework in that way. It really still hides a lot of the most critical of that work.
And you allow us to even to admit that some of it is drudgery. I think I heard you use the word boring. I'm going to say not fun.
Yes.
If anyone's
more generous.
potty trained anybody, that's a haul.
Yes.
So thank you for allowing us to admit to some of the complexities and that it's complicated to feel drawn to something and maybe drawn to more than one thing. You do a really good job of doing some what ifs, Emily. So I'm going to share on page 16 if any of you have purchased a book, and I'm sure you're on your way to do that. And that is, you say, what if? What if we lived in a society that rewarded care of people and environments as much as production and consumption of commodities? You don't answer it, you just ask. I like it. What if we could, and this is my paraphrase, co-create a place where love, kinship, desire, and pleasure were shared in families and environments, and that included housework, and that some of these families and environments were intergenerational. So maybe the 8-year-old who thinks it's fun to clean their litter box has that job, and someone who's actually equipped to actually do something bigger like a bedpan has that job. But no one person has that job. I really love that you give us permission to not necessarily know all the answers to it, but to just keep asking the questions. Speaking of questions, we'd like to now segue to a time for questions and answers for you to, well, we'll see if responses from Emily, from the audience. Anybody curious about this thing called wages? Anyone read the title and go, what? And kind of struggle with the notion that something you do every day that might be considered menial could actually have value beyond just your energy and your love. Yes. The mic is coming around.
Firstly, excuse me. Thank you both. This has been a really interesting discussion. I have not read the book, but I've really been interested in some of the points that you made. One thing that would be helpful, when you talk about housework, it's largely been talked about housework in terms of motherhood versus single women or men. So if you could sort of elaborate on that. And secondly, in terms of solutions, I know you talked about government, but just spitballing here, if you have a dual partnered marriage, traditional husband and wife, if the husband's bringing income to the household and the woman is doing work on behalf of the household, it seems as though there's should be some payment for that within that sort of relationship. Even thinking about companies, you know, recognizing that families are providing for the future generations. I don't know that in your research you've explored or if it's come up looking at non-government sources for those payments, if you could speak to that as well.
Sure. Thank you so much for those questions. Your first one was about the focus on motherhood and thinking about housework beyond motherhood. And I think that's such a great question. And just as a side note, so of these 5 women, 2 of them were mothers. One of them whose child was grown before she even started doing this organizing. And the other, Margaret Prescott, had a young daughter during this. But most of the women in this movement were not mothers at the time. So, which surprised me, you know, because I assumed, as it seems like you did, that this was a movement of mothers. It wasn't mostly that. It was a mix of all kinds of people. And one of the things that they were very careful about was to say it is not wages for housewives, but wages for housework. Because the idea is that anybody should do it, right? They wanted to get rid of the idea that this is just work that women should do, recognizing that historically women have been the ones to do it, and that's why women have then historically been exploited, impoverished. But they wanted to get rid of that link and allow other people, and basically recognize it as work and not just a gender role. And then the question about who should pay for it and other ways of thinking about it, I think that's the most complicated thing about it, is the kind of practical question about who's going to pay, how much will it be. And I think there's a lot of division within the movement about that. I think for certain people in the movement, they would say this is very much a demand for money, because money is the first step to getting power. And women, you know, particularly poor working class women, do not have power. They don't have financial autonomy. So the wage is really important for that. And it's a first step towards building a bigger movement, a bigger, you know, amount of power and say. There's another branch of the movement that I think sees this more as a provocation, you know, basically saying that the entire world runs on this work. Nothing in the economy could function without it. So by demanding a wage for it, you're revealing that reality and demanding that something be done about it, you know, whether it's a paycheck or something bigger. I think their ambition was really to think bigger than just the paycheck and thinking towards how would we transform social relations if we got rid of the idea that this work is not valuable and only work that you do for a boss in a workplace is valuable. That doesn't really answer your question about models outside of the government. I mean, I think there are, you know, ways of thinking about, for example, living communally on a smaller scale. You know, there have been proposals at the UN thinking about, you know, how to reconfigure how we count GDP, for example, to include all of this, and therefore to have that be part of the mechanism for thinking about how we distribute wealth. But these are all kind of, I haven't seen any examples of it really being done in a very practical way, other than, I mean, you can think about things that are in some ways a version of wages for housework, like, you know, like welfare payments, like the family allowance they have in some countries, like the child tax benefit, tax credit. So there are small steps, but it's a great question to think through what some of the possibilities might be.
Great question. Thank you.
Good evening. How are you?
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. I am curious. I study language, and I'm interested in wages for housework. You just mentioned that it's not necessarily about currency, but did you do any work in your book about this idea of wages versus compensation? Is there any investigation on why they called it wages for housework?
It's a great question. And one of the things that I find really interesting, before I answer your question directly, is the characters in this book, Selma James and Maria Rosa Dalla Costa in particular, were talking about this issue of women's unpaid work and, what that means, and particularly, what this meant for someone who was on the cusp of adulthood and thinking about what was going to be expected of her. In Maria Rosa Dalla Costa's case, can you hear me? Okay, there you go. And there were so many different proposals on the table. They proposed, for example, a universal basic income. They proposed a universal 20-hour work week so that everybody could spend more time doing care work. There was discussions about collective public housing that allowed intergenerational families to live together. So they had a lot of ideas. Wages for Housework was one of them, and then it just took off because it was so catchy and so provocative. But I think it was connected to all these other ideas about how might we reorganize society, to recognize this. I think the power of the word wage was they wanted to really make clear that this is work the same way that workers who work in other settings are workers. And I think they really wanted to see themselves as part of the working class and to expand what we think of as a working class to include all these other forms of work. Thank you. Yeah, great question. Thanks.
Yeah, I love that question. It makes my brain go, what would be compensatory enough, right? There's a lot of trading that happens that don't involve, all kinds of ways in which women are creating marketplaces that have nothing to do with dollars and cents. I love that question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
Hello.
So I'm curious your thoughts on sort of opportunities that this moment might offer us, thinking about the convergence of a couple of things. So one, what were the failures of girl boss feminism, right? That a lot of folks in my generation are recognizing this is a scam. But at the same time, there is a lot of investment, especially from the right wing, into sort of capitalizing on that disappointment and pushing women, young women, towards the trad life, also trap. And so thinking of that dynamic, and also in the context of rising anxieties about the global birth rate, and also coming from a lot of tech folks, tech billionaires, right-wing folks, about like pushing people to just have more kids.
Yeah.
And there has been some conversations about, whether it's compensation for having children, how do you incentivize more families to have more kids? And so, yeah, it seems like there's a lot of both disappointment on the ways that we have understood work, and failed to recognize, the unpaid work that happens in the home and just for reproductive labor in general. And at the same time, this moment where people are looking for something. And so I'm curious what opportunities you think might exist in this moment where like there is some push for rewarding some kind of reproductive labor, but not necessarily like recognizing the value of reproductive labor.
Yeah, thank you. Those such brilliant thoughts. I love all the stuff you just brought together. I think my initial response when I started to hear some of this pronatalist discourse and, the whole, we have to support childcare so women can go back to the kitchen, it's terrifying. And I find it so contrary to the spirit of Wages for Housework, which is all about women having autonomy, not having to live in a nuclear family, not having to be dependent on men, whereas I find the discourse about pronatalism and traditional gender roles is all about enforcing gender roles and dependence. So I was feeling so much disappointment that supporting mothers became a right-wing talking point. Like why they could seize that territory was very upsetting to me. The question about opportunities, to see things differently. I mean, it's interesting. So for example, I think there are a lot of conversations right now that are somewhat adjacent to the Wages for Housework idea. Like, for example, a lot of the pilot programs for basic income, that really try to provide income for people to live, that is, separate from having to prove your worth through productivity, you know. A lot of the pilot programs are specifically targeted towards mothers, you know, as compensation for that work, but also supporting, you know, what the vulnerability and labor of being a new parent. So I think basic income in some ways is a kind of adjacent sort of program. Another area where I see a lot of interesting conversations happening is in both in the US and in Europe, programs for a Green New Deal, talking about how to decarbonize the economy, how to center the economy around green jobs. You know, a lot of the insights from feminists have been, we already have a lot of green jobs, you know, that are carbon neutral, if not beneficial to the environment, you know, which is care work, right? So thinking about how to organize an economy that prioritizes care work is part of thinking about a green transition. So I think those are the main places I'm seeing a lot of potential for thinking about how that kind of support can be part of a broader social movement. Thank you.
Great question. Other questions?
Thank you for this conversation. I was curious from a historical perspective, sometimes when we see people that normally associate their experiences with privilege, when they're touched by the experiences of people who are more traditionally marginalized, sometimes we see changes in the momentum of a movement. And so you were talking about in the 90s when it became more commonplace for women to be the primary breadwinner perhaps, or at least to be in the workplace more, and men having more home-based experiences. Was there any change in the way that this movement in particular looked, or was there any additional momentum that was added to it when men became more aware of those experiences?
Thanks for that question. In terms of the shifts that I think happened in the 80s and 90s, I think the biggest one was, you know, Reagan and Thatcher and neoliberalism, and so much of what feminists had been fighting for in terms of a welfare state, in terms of support for subsidized childcare and things that could be considered components of wages for housework were cut. So I think it was a really terrible decade for the movement in that way. Yeah, I don't know how much. I'm trying to think about how those insights about the you know, how much the dual income families became the norm, how much that changed. I think that a lot of the organizing was based on working class women, you know, to begin with. So thinking about, for example, people from the National Welfare Rights Association organization, you know, as the allies of this movement, thinking about how to defend benefits. I mean, currently they've been organizing around the child tax credit, right, and things like that, you know, against child separation from their families, you know, organizing to help women who are dealing with a foster care system that, you know, is discriminatory, you know. So a lot of that work really does focus more on working class families than, you know, the more middle class model. But I think it's a really great question. I'd like to look into it. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this work, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
I think I'm engaging the topic more than what you have talked about here. Going back to the recognition about language and wages, I'm thinking about more seasoned women now, wages and benefits. Has there been a part of this movement historically, or thinking now about what the latter part of life looks like? Were there benefits? What about health care for humans who did housework rather than build up a 401k or and retirement? I'm just wondering if those portions of the compensation, wages and benefits, are a part of this discourse. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Absolutely, it's very much part of the discourse. One of the things they talk about, for example, is widows' pensions, you know, and particularly, you know, one of the places I think it came closest to actually, you know, getting through the U.S. Congress was in conversations about, you know, in the 1970s, particularly with increasing divorce rates. You had women who had worked for decades caring for families and children, if your husband runs off with the secretary, like takes the pension with him, like what does that mean, for women in later stages of their life? So definitely thinking about pensions, thinking about those kinds of benefits is very much in the purview of how they were thinking about it, and one of the things that the New York Wages for Housework Committee, just to give you one example, was thinking about was how to make living in the city more accessible for retired women, for older women, who had spent their life caring for the workers and the children of New York. What kinds of ways could you subsidize, better housing for them, better healthcare benefits, pensions. So it's definitely part of the conversation. Thank you.
I'll say your book has caused a lot of conversation in my house.
Okay.
And I think my wife and I have gone back and forth about how do you itemize it.
Oh, yeah.
Dishwashing, $2.50. Changing a diaper, $3.25.
Yeah.
A woman takes time away from work. Where I work, the male can take time away from work and they still get paid. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the beauty of it is you've brought a lot of conversation to the table. I'm not going to win the argument at the house. I can go ahead and tell you that. But I did complete my dare. I did ask a question. Okay. And I don't know if there's an answer there when you sit down at the table and you have men and women sit and have conversation, and some of us men are more traditional. I grew up in a home where my mother worked and my father worked, but we were kids at the house and mom worked, and then she took care of us. And if dad ever washed the dishes, it would be a miracle. My mind doesn't do this. So I grew up in that house, but then in my home we share the responsibilities and things like that. So I guess my question after all of that is, how do you bring that to the table so that you say, what's the value? Someone mentioned, you said that if the husband runs off with the secretary, well, we have laws in place now that you have where, you still get paid and all of that. And so I think there's a skim of what people realize, that there's payment there or wages there because the work is very valuable. But how do we move from just a conversation to bringing it to the table and saying, hey, how do we really kick this can down the road?
Yeah, thanks so much for those reflections and for that really provocative question. And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to think through as well that I don't have an answer for, and I'm not sure they did either, which is you can think about wages for housework as an argument that we should elevate housework to the same level of all other kinds of work in our society, and that's a way to make it more equal, to spread the wealth more equally. The nervousness I feel about that is, do I want to put a price on everything? Do I want to be, talking to my son in the middle of the night about his nightmare and then fill out a time card to get paid? I'm exaggerating, but there's a real question about, do we want to invite capitalism into our most personal spaces, right? So that's the I think the real sort of argument about for and against elevating housework to work in that sense. I think the more idealistic, ambitious vision here is that by doing away with the distinction between work that we consider valuable and work that is unvaluable, you can imagine or start to imagine what it may be like to have a world that is not organized at all around the concept of work or commodities, that tries to do away with that distinction as a way of then thinking about how might we do things differently. That does, as you say, kick the can down the road because it's not a prescription or a policy outline, but that I think is the real philosophical agenda maybe here. So.
I think it's worth. Do you see a hand?
Yeah,
Oh yes. Dixie Rose.
Hello. When I was reading this book, another thing that someone else had asked as well is what's the benefit to the partner? And in there, I remember you had mentioned that this idea of by paying for the housework, you are therefore effectively a two-income household again. And it does end up freeing up the worker, the man in the situation or whatever. It does end up freeing that person and allowing them to join a union or allowing them to take a job that has less hours. And then they do get to be a part of the family. But in reading that, it also reminded me a lot of COVID. And it reminded me a lot of how I think for a lot of people, like, we were home, we were investigating these thoughts about our work-life balance. We were paying more attention to the news. We had George Floyd happen, and Black Lives Matter rise up, and just all these things that we were able to sort of participate and pay better attention to the world around us. And like, we sort of have been dancing about like, how do we nickel and dime this? How do we put a price on this? But I think, it's also interesting to think about, again, like you've been saying, that this is more about how do we interact with society, how do we interact with our community, and find that work-life balance and find other ways to, just be a part of the system, but also find ways to benefit from it in a more personal way. And I don't really know what the question is there, but I was just really struck by, I guess, that COVID sort of awakened this again. And do you find that? Did you find that maybe there is a hunger for that sort of work-life balance, if not necessarily this wage for housework, but maybe something in there where people can investigate their lives in communities?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And it gets back to the quotation you read earlier, which was, this was, the early movement in the 70s was really kind of pushing back at the idea that a woman should work a double shift. They should be killing it at, the office and then like working another 8-hour shift at home, right? Is the idea that, how is that liberation? That's working twice as much. But like the idea that we want really good subsidized childcare so that we can actually live meaningful in our communities. We shouldn't have to justify it by going to hustle, One of the powerful movement arguments in here, and one of the major kind of coalitions here, was Margaret Prescott in particular was very involved in the welfare rights movement. And part of the idea was that if women's work as mothers, as community members, is compensated, that allows them to have a little leverage to not go and take some minimum wage horrible job. The idea that work is always liberating, I think, was something that was held dear by a lot of feminists, but particularly middle-class feminists who had their choice of profession. But for working class and poor women, work doesn't have the same kind of connotation of liberation, right? So the idea that having this compensation, this financial autonomy, can give you power over your own life, power over your own time, to give you leverage to not have to take the first available thing that comes up that might be exploitative and might be not worth your time. To not feel that as the breadwinner you have to work 80 hours a week, because if you stop, or if you go on strike, or if you take a risk, your whole family's going to be destitute because your wife also has an income. I think there's that sense of, one of the ways that Selma James put it is, wages for housework, most simply, is an argument for more power for the working class. Whether your working class position is in a workplace or in the home, it's having that leverage to have more control over your time.
Okay. I will say that Emily has given us some homework for up here. She begins the book saying, "In the duller moments of my life, it awakens something in my imagination, connecting my daily efforts to lives and labors beyond the four walls of my house." She ends the book the same way, with an invitation for us to imagine a place beyond where we are, that we can actually think about the little crevices in our minds that might feel like great compensation. And it may not be money, but it may be something that feels like fulfillment. Page 226, she says, "Theorist Frederick Jameson remarked, 'It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism.' We are told that our society must be organized around the premise that we are all individual rational actors, seeking our self-interest on the free market, that this is how to get things done. Let us consider instead an alternative and undeniable premise, that we are all the products of housework, not in a sentimental sense, but in a material, embodied economic sense. None of us exists outside of this labor. To begin envisioning and creating the foundations for another world, we don't have to go far. We can start where we are." And I think this is a beautiful start. So thank you, Emily. We're going to take that homework and think about it. Imagine, what can we create? Another world. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Tasmin, and thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Emily. Thank you, Tasneem, for such an invigorating conversation. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves. Again, we want to thank Parnassus for here. If you would like to purchase a copy of the book, Emily will be over there signing, and we can have a meet and greet if you have any other questions for her. And again, thank you to the Nashville Public Library Foundation and the Sandra Schouten Foundation for making tonight's conversation possible. And thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.